Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson of Noetic, the humanities teaching app. Go ahead and download that. I'm here today with CJ Eller. CG Eller is an imaginary person in my head, but CJ Eller is a very gifted interlocutor who will be helping me today try to get at the nucleus of thought that's within Soren Kierkegaard's On the Occasion of a Wedding. It's the second essay in Kierkegaard's book, Three Discourses on Imagined Occasions. Previously, we discovered On the Occasion of Confession. Next week, we'll be discussing At a Graveside with Matthew William Brake. So, before we dive into the text, let's get CJ's kind of perspective on what we're dealing with today. What did you think about this book?
Well, what I found quite interesting was that we were dealing with Kierkegaard's other view of marriage in the present moment, which we did a couple weeks prior. And that was a rather scathing interpretation of marriage. And here we get a rather positive, but still different than a normal view of marriage. He doesn't exactly condone what we think of as love, or what he'll call erotic love, but he tries to get at the seriousness of what marriage is. So, in a sense, it's faint praise, I think, of marriage. It's different from what we've looked at before, but I think it's still within the vein of Kierkegaard, of what we've discovered from him already.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting. So this book was written. I have to go back and check my notes from the first podcast, but this was written somewhere around 1843 or 1844. Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah, somewhere around that.
Told me.
And the moment was, or the present moment, depending on how you translate it. I think it's more generally the moment. We read selections from the present moment. I think that might not, that translation title may not be the accepted one now since the Hong edition came out. But anyway, in the moment, he is really critical of marriage and actually gets close to advocating this idea. He takes, like, I believe it's Paul's view that's like, it's better to marry than to burn. It's like, oh my God, if you have to marry, but like really to truly imitate Christ, you've got to be like solo and celibate and monastic and all of this other stuff. And I believe there's some parts in the journals where people think that Kierkegaard was actually advocating a view that to truly be a Christian, you've got to be an advocate for the extinction of the human race. You can't drag any more souls down from heaven. Here, the idea is like, okay, well, what is redeemable about love? And I think an idea that keeps coming up in our discussions about Soren Kierkegaard is something when not only when I say our, I mean conversations with you and Robert and Jordan, whoever else that I'm talking about Soren with, is trying to understand how we don't end up just appropriating monkish virtues and we can still live within the world as existentialist Christians for Soren Kierkegaard. I think it's been a big concern for you, like how do we do art as existentialist Christians? And in this discourse, we're going to be talking about how we can still love and love like engage in romantic love, the wedding ceremony, as existentialist Christians so that we don't have to become priests. Now, you may say this doesn't fit with Kierkegaard's general sort of paradigm that he perhaps evolved on this issue, but everything else kind of fits into the general program of Soren Kierkegaard. I don't see radical departures other than that.
It's still within the lens of his thinking, which I appreciate, and which we can learn by reading one philosopher or thinker time and time again, is that we understand the way that they think. So then when we approach something like marriage, even though it might be different from what we've read previously, it still makes sense. Yeah. I don't know if you sense any contradictions within this work at all.
No. It's just a tone. It's this, like you said, it's faint praise versus disgust in the moment. But I mean, he's not categorically opposed to it in the moment. And you know, I think he tries to find. I think he does see something beautiful and redeemable about marriage in this text. So let's get to it. Yeah. And the idea is, look, I found this a very difficult. I think it may have been a little bit easier for you than for me when we talked off mic earlier or whatever. I don't know what it looks like. People may assume out there that this stuff is easy for us, for me, whoever. I can assure you that it's not. This took me a couple days to get through, and I hope that I can effectively communicate. This is the first time I've ever talked about it, so
same here.
Yeah, so here we go, man. So what Kierkegaard starts off by saying, he starts to consider what erotic love is, and we would consider that kind of the typical sort of secular romantic ideal of love, where you're just like your Prince Charming or Princess Charming, your princess, your damsel in distress, your Prince Charming, whatever the analog is if you're a male or if you're homosexual. So he's trying to describe that, and he says, look, there's a panoply of mood states that are associated with erotic love, and it's a very ephemeral thing. It's a very hard thing to stabilize. Like, there's a certain sort of idolatry of the other. There's a certain sort of slavishness, and I see this a lot, to be honest. Like, I'm very monastic in my life right now, but I encounter a lot of people that are in relationships, and many of them are very unhappy. And a lot of people assume that I'm incredibly lonely because I'm not a part of that. But I think they might have a misrelation to one another where they're slavishly devoted to one another, so that their happiness is predicated on the mood states of the other individual. So there's this, and because you're always kind of like trying to offset what someone else is experiencing, it's a constantly disorienting feeling. And I don't know. I think there's actually a rather good insight into love. I mean, in our culture today, we tend to view love as this panacea, but Kierkegaard actually says this can lead to incredible despair. And as a person in his mid-30s, like, I've seen the gambit of this. What do you think about his assessment of romantic love?
The Argentinian writer who I admire, Jorge Luis Borges, he said love was the worship of a fallible. It's a religion based on a fallible God.
Yeah.
So, when you put all that promise into one person and they don't deliver, then what are you going to do? It only can lead to despair. So, I think Kierkegaard is setting up what he's done in other avenues and other works where he says, okay, well, let's see what we have with erotic love, or dare we say aesthetic or poetic kind of love. All right, it might seem great at the surface level, but let's dig into it and see. And he doesn't find much depth, and that leaves us with a lack. And then he has to say, okay, well, what is the solution?
Yeah. And this is interesting because, and I love this move of Kierkegaard. This is an idea that he will develop more in the Philosophical Fragments, which I think this text is either slightly before or slightly after. But
okay.
A lot of the upbuilding discourses and stuff like that are in between Stages on Life's Way and upbuilding discourses and Fear and Trembling. It's all sort of happening contemporaneously. But what's going on is that he finds something very interesting about romantic love. Romantic love starts off as this sort of like selfishness. And he'll talk about this in the Philosophical Fragments, and not so much here. But it is this selfishness that gives way to ultimate care for the other. And he'll analogize reason. He says, like, every passion within man gives way to its opposite. So, like, love gives way, selfish love, narcissism sort of gives way to infatuation with the other. Reason eventually sort of gives way to faith or some sort of irrational sort of understanding of things. And what he talks about this, how strange it is that, like, we have this erotic love that wants to make a promise to the other forever. Like, when you find someone that you love, you can't imagine that sensation is so freeing. You can't imagine ever living without it. So there's like this inbuilt psychological press that says, look, you've got to dedicate this person to forever. But the very nature of erotic love is fleeting. So he senses a paradox. He says on page 43, what is more transparent and intended for the future than a sacred promise? And what is less perceived with the future than the presence of erotic love in the lovers? And yet here a promise is required of love. What is so terrible to name as a curse? And what is so remote from this as the sheer joy of erotic love? And yet the word must be named in connection with love. So what I understand him to be saying is that erotic love wants to make this forever promise in this covenant, but ultimately it can't sustain it. So people get locked into this covenant and just feel shackled by it. And if they do get married without any reference to anything else but their erotic love, they feel imprisoned by the thing that got them into it to begin with. So that they either divorce, right? And then they are haunted by that for the rest of their lives because they broke a sacred covenant that the erotic love thing was pressing towards to begin with. Or they live in sort of empty functional marriages that where they have no real connection to one another. And I thought that was a pretty profound insight.
And maybe that's something that Kierkegaard wants us to have in the back of our heads when we make that commitment, or that we have to have the experience of witnessing this kind of love and participating in it, and then, like you said, going to the other side in some way. By going on one side, you magically appear on the, you drill a hole from America and then you end up in China in some weird respect, I suppose, just by digging into that. And I don't know if that goes in with what Kierkegaard will say later about experiencing life, and that then you can make a commitment to somebody else. You can have the resolution to be a proper marriage partner in some way.
Yeah. Well, I actually think he wants it more than in the back of our mind. I think he wants it front and center.
Yeah.
And, he's going to talk about throughout this, like, how that's not cool. Like, nobody wants to hear about how hard marriage is. Nobody wants to hear about how the erotic love will flame out. No one wants to hear about the ominous nature of, like, making an existential resolution, whatever that means. And we'll get into what that means.
Yeah.
And that's we think we know what that means. But what Kierkegaard is going to say on the occasion of a wedding is that it shouldn't, when we do get married, it shouldn't be like, like this celebration of romantic love and this joy, like all this festivities and frivolous parties and stuff like that. It's like, no, this is to be done in like equal part seriousness and earnestness and sobriety, because like it is, the magnitude of the covenant is such a big deal.
And that's within the first part of this. He addresses who he is pertaining this discourse to, and I will quote, he says, "And the discourse will address itself to you, honorable bridegroom. It will not be congratulatory, but will question with earnestness, and the speaker has the authority to require an earnest answer." So he is, like you said, not pertaining to, hey, you're going to get married, congratulations, that's so cool. No, he says, look, I need you to ask yourself and ask your partner and consult with God and within your soul whether you all are ready for this monumental task and the pain and the pressure that comes with it and the ultimate joy that will come with it, but the work that has to be done.
Yeah, totally. I love the fact that you've gone and introduced the divine and stuff like that, because that anticipates where I'm going next with this, is that Kierkegaard is going to say that ultimately, in order to have some sort of stabilized marriage, you got to get God in between the lovers. In some way, there's got to be this sort of triangulation where everything is sort of referenced back in a covenant before God, where the individuals have to make a continuous sort of confession before God in order to constantly renew their relationship. But what's interesting about this is that so Kierkegaard is very interested in making sure that it isn't just when one gets married, that it isn't just a superficial arrangement of terms, whereas the woman goes from Ms. to Mrs. or the man goes from bachelor to husband or something like that. We're not just giving things new names, that there's actually going to be an internal differentiation between the erotic love and that wedding ceremony. It's going to be an outward signification of the internal earnestness that's made in ethico-religious commitment.
So it's not just the temporal things that we should focus on when we're talking about marriage, I
Absolutely
suppose.
not. Yeah, it's going to be a total transformation of one's being. Look, Kierkegaard's going to say that the wedding presents an opportunity for one to really get at the essence of themselves, is an opportunity for ethical religious discovery. Marriage is not in the cards for everybody. It may not be in the cards for me. I may never get married. That doesn't mean that I won't have other opportunities to discover what I am in my quintessence. Like this project right here, could be an opportunity to fulfill ethical religious ideals or whatever. I don't necessarily need another person to discover that, but marriage might be a way for many, many people to dig deep and find out what it really means to be an ethically existing agent and even to find God. So that's not to say that I don't need marriage because I have an ethical project based up in education or something like that. But I don't know. Maybe I'll have the best of both worlds. Maybe I'll get married one day, and then I'll be doubly ethical and doubly religious.
Which makes me wonder how a married person would view this text, because honestly, both you and I are far beyond a married person, so it's just like, two single dudes trying to discuss this text. So I'm wondering.
This is so weird.
I know. So I'm wondering what somebody married or about to get married would take from this text, and maybe this is a good way to sober up anybody that will or is interested in marriage. I mean, that is something Kierkegaard even says, where he says, appropriate this text for what is, for the past, present, or your future. You have to use what I'm giving you. Use this discourse in whatever stage of life that you may be, but just know that marriage takes a lot of work, whether you're in it or thinking about it.
I think it's perspectival. It's going to depend on where you are. Like, for instance, for me, like, I can talk about how it's affecting me right now. Mm-hmm. Like, it's drumming home this point that, like, if I'm to get confessional here or whatever, that I probably need to find someone who's interested in making the same sort of covenant with me. Because, like, mm-hmm. if I just personally relate to God and make the covenant, like, there's no guarantee that individual is in the same sort of binding sort of covenant with me. Like their erotic love may just flame out, and they may lose total interest in me.
Sure.
Because there isn't sort of that triangulation of the ethical religious resolution. Individuals that are getting married, maybe this is sort of like an opportunity for them to reform it. Or if individuals who never made this sort of existential ethico-religious transformation and got married purely under romantic secular terms and find themselves in a marriage that's disrupted, this can, if you're that far into it, depending where you are, like, this could be like a really tough pill to swallow. So I guess what I'm trying to say is some people will welcome it mm-hmm. and view it as a reinforcement of something they already know. Other people will cause a reshuffling of priorities, and some people are going to be really upset with this. They're going to be offended by this. And Kierkegaard's, he's saying, like, hey, like, I'm just letting you know this now. And I think you ought to prioritize it at a very young age and very early on in your marriage, because I'm trying to save you a bunch of trouble.
Yeah.
Like if you try to do this, like, when you're, like, 80, like, you think about all the sort of how hard it will be able to do and how long you've gone without it.
Yeah, and Kierkegaard will mention that when we get into the Love Conquers Everything, like the meat of the discourse, where he talks about how some people will look back on their lives and say, oh, if I could only have started earlier. I almost think of Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, where you have this guy who's super successful, had a good wife, blah, 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 good life, and then he just got sick all of a sudden, and he's just on his deathbed just thinking about how crappy his life was, and how he said, oh my goodness, if I could only change my mind and do different things. So I think what Kierkegaard is doing is quite ethical. Even if he says he doesn't have the authority, I think it's quite important. And it's something that he says too, just realize how earnest this is, and just even if you don't agree with me or don't understand what I'm saying, at least take into account what work marriage is, and in the covenant too, like you said. I think that was great you mentioned that, because I know sometimes I undermine having the same religious views, or sometimes I say, why do you always have to date Catholic guys? Talking to girls, I'm like, why? My good friends are like, why do you have to try to find a guy that's Catholic? Blah blah blah. But it makes sense within Kierkegaard's views, because look, if you can't have somebody that's going to agree with the covenant and they're just based on erotic terms or just romantic terms, that's just going to fizzle out. So I think it's great that you mentioned that, and I mean, it's great that Kierkegaard mentioned that. So.
Yeah, what's interesting is that we don't get a lot of specifics on the nature of the covenant here. No. I mean, I think if you know anything about Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard is a Protestant, and so that he doesn't. There's not really a lot of mention of Christ here. I don't believe. I don't have much in my notes about Christ.
Not that I remember. It's just God.
Yeah. So the question, I think an interesting question is, what do you do in an interface situation? Can let's say if individuals can make this sort of covenant resolution if they're drawing before God and they have different faith traditions, is that going to be a stable situation for Kierkegaard? Or, I mean, I see a lot of marriages working in the interfaith.
Sure.
I have a number of friends who are Jewish and Catholic, and they seem to do pretty well together. Sure. Sometimes better than Protestants and Catholics do.
And it'll be worthy of note to see whether, as we go on and understand what earnestness is and resolution, whether we can make it so that, okay, you don't necessarily have to believe in the same God, but there is something about earnestness that maybe transcends religious boundaries. Dare I say, even whether you believe in God or not. But I think with Kierkegaard, he's going to say, oh, no. You got to believe in God. So...
Yeah, I think we're tempted to think that like the ethical covenant alone will be enough, but we'll learn a little bit later on that he actually thinks it's really inseparable from God.
No, that's great. So we're going to get the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious view.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. So, and the only thing I want to say before going on to the section about love conquers everything, like it sounds like Kierkegaard's a major killjoy. It's like everything is like very legalistic and like religious and stuff like that. But Kierkegaard's going to make a point of it, saying, I know this is very heavy on like making a covenant and stuff like that, but it kind of creates a safe space for erotic love to endure, right? So like if you really want to keep the romantic, the aesthetical, the erotic love enduring throughout your entire existence with a person, you've got to kind of like build a ethical religious wall around it, and I see that. I mean I can't tell you. Well, let me think about how to phrase this. There are really, how to say this? It is possible to be an aesthetically beautiful person, and if one has not properly internalized certain commitments, to become unattractive. And it is the case, as we looked at in the crisis of a life and actress, in that particular case where the I guess Frau Heiberg was repeating her role as Juliet. He was talking about how when she came back to the role, she played it at 15 and then she played it again at 31, that she brought a new ethical beauty to it. And what Kierkegaard is saying is that a way that the husband and wife make themselves sort of perpetually beautiful to one another is that in this ethical religious covenant, they have a sort of eternal healthiness and vitality to them that romantic love can't really preserve, because like our bodies are going to get older, but like the so much as like this idea of ethics and God is woven into our being. I think he thinks that we like kind of forever remain beautiful on some level, or we draw ourselves closer and become more beautiful in that way. And I think there's some, I have friends that just seem to get more attractive with age, and I think it's because like they're just badass people, because they're just like, they're really ethical people. Like they don't look like they did to me in high school, but in some way they're more beautiful than they were then. And I make a point to tell them too. It's awkward, but it's a little. I would want someone to say that to me, but anyway. I don't know. Anything else before we go into the love conquers everything?
Well, let's get into it.
No. Okay.
Though I'm going to be curious whether age plays a factor, just like we were talking about in the present moment, about how Kierkegaard said, well, one can't make a religious commitment to God if they're just a baby, or if they're 13 years old, how lovely. I wonder if Kierkegaard's going to say, or whether he'll imply in this text, that there is experience needed, or a certain amount, whether that be an age or certain events needed to be able to have the resolution and earnestness to commit to that tripartite sort of relationship in marriage. Yeah. I think Kierkegaard in other places, the way that I understand Kierkegaard's conception of sin, and this could be incorrect, but it seems like one that is emerging throughout the text, is that unlike Augustine, where the whole human race like fell at once, or the whole universe fell at once,
it seems like each individual falls. So like children and youths and babies and things like that, they have a sort of closeness to perfection in a way. But then as they become sort of conscious and can sin, they sort of fall and are in need of ethical and religious sort of resolution. So I don't know. It's hard to pin down the age of that, but I would still think I would think that Kierkegaard would say that making an ethical religious commitment wouldn't be something possible until you're at least a young adult.
Sure.
You know, I think he'd probably still think that you're too immature to enter into those arrangements. I don't know what the age is. Maybe that played into his. I mean, he was in his 20s when he was dating his fiance, who was like 16 or something like that. So I don't. Maybe he felt like she wasn't ready for this particular type of covenant. Maybe that played into his thinking in some way. I don't know.
Sure, it's funny because whenever I look back on myself, I said, "Man, I tried to date in high school. That's such a weird time. Like, you know, and I say that again for college. It's such a weird time." And dare I say, even now, I say, "Wow, I don't think I'm mature enough for a committed relationship." So it's funny how it seems that you have to maybe find some kind of maturity in yourself to commit, and whether that is a certain time, because let's face it, there are high school sweethearts, right, that are still married and probably married until they die. So I wonder if they had to either A, commit themselves early and say, okay, we're gonna do this, or whether through their marriage and their relationship they develop that.
It probably grew together.
Yeah.
I would say, especially the high school sweetheart scenario. But I mean, the thing is with Kierkegaard, it's not automatic. I mean, you can be you can be a 50-year-old dude and still be like a scumbag and still have failed to like mature to the level of where you can be an ethical religious agent or whatever, and enter into a very childish sort of relationship.
So it's not age,
and many do.
Work. I like that.
Yeah.
It's work. So let's get into the work of love.
So just to give yourself some credit, you could be mature enough for it right now at the age of 24, more mature than maybe many 50-year-olds.
Sure.
So, all right. So this whole notion. So we say about love that love conquers everything, and like Kierkegaard's like, what? You know, I guess even at that time, Kierkegaard understood that this thing was this expression, love conquering everything, was becoming secularized, and it was like this trivial thing that people just said, and no one really understood what it meant.
I'm sure they took was it Plato's Symposium, where they're like, love was there in the beginning, you know, it's older than time, and that it just appears just like love. Here it is. Yeah, I'm here.
Well, I never really thought about it. I've heard that expression, love conquers everything. I don't think I attributed any meaning to it, but Kierkegaard gives us kind of a little bit of a theoretical framework for us to understand this. And I don't know. Do you want to take a stab at it, or do you want me to explain it?
I think I can maybe quote Kierkegaard.
Sure, please do.
I mean, he does again mention the Symposium, or Plato's Symposium, and he says, you know, love is older than anything else. He's like, okay, what is that about? And then he says about love, its happy awakening is unacquainted with work, and there is no advanced preparation. Even if love can give birth to pain, it is not brought forth in pain. Lightly, jubilantly, it bursts forth in its enigmatic coming into existence. What a wonderful beginning. I don't know if he's being ironic here, but
yeah, I think he might be. See, that I didn't.
It's a little scathing.
Yeah, it's been so long since I've had a relationship that I had a hard time relating to this. I was like, what is he talking about? Like love existing forever. I think I guess I have to do an experiment. I'll have to fall in love with somebody.
Do your own little seducer's diary. Yeah, very funny.
Anyone wants to fall in love, hit me up. It seems like what he's saying is that like it's just so dreamy and so like, and this is the erotic form of love. This is not the ethical form of love that we're talking about. That like, presumably, like when you get caught up in this new love affair or whatever, it's like the only thing that existed. It's like the most important thing ever. I had trouble sort of relating to that, but what he then talks about with this love conquering everything. And I thought this was kind of fascinating because this is said at weddings. I don't know if this is in that First Corinthians passage or whatever, where it talks about love is kind and tender and all these other things. Love conquering everything. I think what he means there in ethico-religious covenant is that if you've made that bond to another person and ultimately to God, there's nothing in the external world that's going to be able to throw that off. So the commitment, the internal resolution to God and to one another makes it so that nothing can disrupt your marriage.
Yeah.
So like there's not going to be some like mistress that could come along and cause infidelity. There's not going to be money issues that could like disrupt the marriage. There's not going to be health issues or like accidents or whatever else, like that ultimately, even if that person were to pass away, like there's going to be some, like you can't be deprived of your earnestness and internal resolution. There's nothing that's going to be able to throw anything off. So the covenant actually puts all temptation and anything that could possibly make you a miserable person within erotic love, like it holds it at a distance because you're ultimately relating to God and the other properly.
And I think that's why he's frustrated with romantic love, because as I'll use the same passage again, it's a happy awakening and is unacquainted with work, and there's no advanced preparation.
It comes
Kierkegaard's going to say there is advanced preparation and there is work that is involved that to get to the point that you were talking about where nothing can get in the way. It doesn't just happen.
No, it's every day you have to sort of make this sort of resolution and dedication to it. And if you have not, like it can go as quickly as it comes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can start to look at that person, like that's in your class or at work with a wandering eye, or you can start to really disrespect your husband or your wife because of the drain on your finances or something to that degree. And interestingly here, Kierkegaard's like, look, you really have to see who is the artist that do this? Is it Pat Benatar?
Love is a battlefield. I was going to quote that too.
Love is I don't know if Pat Benatar had been reading Kierkegaard because she does have a hit single called Love is a Battlefield, but Kierkegaard anticipates the Pat Benatar single and says, look, it's not going to be this festive sort of playground, that ultimately it's going to be something that's going to be hard fought for every single day. And that's cool because it causes you to internally strengthen.
And Kierkegaard has a great little passage pertaining to that. He says, marriage does not greet the lovers as conquerors, but invites them to conflict, forces them in the God-pleasing battleground of the state of marriage, encourages them to fight the good fight, strengthens the contenders by means of the covenant, promises them victory as it accepts their promise, gives them the blessing for the long journey. Yeah, and Kierkegaard's like, look, I know this is a hard conversation, but we need to have it. I'm trying, because there's nothing more beautiful than happens if you're entering into this covenant in the right way. And if you don't, on page 49, he says, if the commitment to a sacred covenant is left unfulfilled or dubiously fulfilled, is this not like an objection that makes the last journey into a swindler's flight? But no, what is the use of fleeing the justice that judging watches over existence? No one escapes that. So I think there is going to be this sort of understanding that if we aren't properly fulfilling the covenant that we enter into or whatever, that it's like we're going to feel convicted in some way, either judged by God or ourselves or conscience or whatever. So, there's good reason. If we don't do this, inevitably misery is going to creep in because we're going to feel like we have not lived up to what our erotic love promised for us. A younger version of us said, hey, I'll love you forever. And then we find ourselves like, Jesus Christ, why did you go and make that commitment? And he even says, he's like Al Bundy. I don't know if you watched Married with Children growing up a lot. He would always he would always fantasize about dying. He would always joke about committing suicide to get out of his marriage. He would talk about hanging himself or whatever else. And I think there's a lot of people who feel like that. That they get trapped in their marriages because they haven't taken this covenant seriously enough, and they just off themselves. And Kierkegaard, somewhere else, I forget where he says it, but he says something to the effect of, there's no prison is worse than the one we make for ourselves. There's all if I were to be thrown into solitary confinement, a jail or whatever. I mean, I'm pretty much in solitary confinement already here in this house, and in the sense all I do is read and study and do this stuff. That's a very stoic view.
Yeah,
I mean, you could even think of people like Malcolm X who became who they were because they were in jail, and all he did was just read and just
some people, like, jail is like a very like formative experience for them.
It's
like
an education
yeah,
if you can make it that way. So marriage, in some sense, can be an education if you make it that way, and not so much a shackle, but a learning experience, I suppose.
I think it'd be really cool if this, what we're doing here, were to catch on within prisons. I think that, no, I'm serious. Yeah. I'm a big fan of like libraries, and I don't know if that's possible. I don't know what the rules are, but I actually would kind of like the idea, not unlike Johnny Cash going to Folsom Prison. I hope they're listening to us in Folsom. That would be kind of cool.
It would be.
So yeah, if you're in Folsom, you can have a really good life. Still, according to Stoics and Christian existentialists. We say that so flippantly, but yeah. I mean, that's true if you read these things. Yeah. So yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting that he mentions that we sort of like, if we don't go about this covenant in the right way, we can sort of pine for the sweet embrace of death.
No, and that goes for Kierkegaard's insistence throughout all of his work about avoiding the half measures, of avoiding just kind of committing to something. He says, no, we gotta commit all of the way. So, I mean, it's the same with love conquering everything or marriage. You have to commit to it all the way. You can't just have fanciful notions of it.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say here. I mean, just to reinforce what we said already on page 51, 52, Kierkegaard says, And if one has begun with a resolution, it will certainly become apparent what benefit there is in it, because with the resolution one did not take in an invigorating breath of youth, but a mistrust of oneself that a distance knows about the danger. Mm-hmm. So essentially he wants us to get to it. There's a certain sort of urgency to making this covenant. Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about that, how he's ultimately trying to save us a lot of trouble. So he's in this last third of the work, he's going to talk about two conditions that are absolutely essential for the resolution to be made, and we're going to find out that they're inextricably linked. And that you can draw. You want me to do it? So on page 52, the first condition for the resolution is, and this is something I'm going to try to understand in talking it out with you, because I'm not sure I have a good categorical sort of understanding of it, or have put it into the proper category is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. The first condition for a resolution is to will to have a true conception of life and of oneself. And that sounds deep. And it is deep, but I think we need to understand what Kierkegaard means by a true conception of life and of oneself. He says, when we make this covenant, in order to do it, and we have this true conception of life and oneself, that it will involve some sort of initial sorrow. Presumably, that's the confession, the preceding sort of essay that we talked about. It's part one of the 3 Discourses on Imagined Occasions. But that, like you said, to start off the podcast, it involves courage, it toughens, it involves conquering. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's all begun in sorrow, in confession. And he says on page 53, it is only the humility of the resolution that makes her pleasing in the eyes of God. That the people involved in the arrangement become beautiful before each other in their humility before God.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of having that the resolution must include a realization of the troubles and of the things that you're going to endure through this marriage or through life in general. And I think with it also includes that one needs God. There's a necessity of God being in that marriage or in that relationship for it to work. Yeah,
and I think we'll dwell on that, and we'll draw that out more in the second resolution. But mm-hmm. I'm not trying to discount what you just said, because I think it's very right.
But it's acknowledging the struggle, I suppose. Yeah. Maybe we don't have to say it, but through the lack, he's going to say, okay, we need to fill it up with something that cannot wither away.
Yeah, and I think that's this E word. I think when he's talking about what this true conception of the self is, I think it is going to be earnestness, whatever earnestness is. Now, it probably has different names in other texts of Kierkegaard, but he says on page 58, by the person who by marriage binds another person's life to his own, who by marriage makes a commitment that no time will dissolve and every day will require to be fulfilled. From that person, a resolution is required, and in this resolution, therefore, a true conception of oneself. And this true conception of oneself, the inwardness of this conception, this is the earnestness. And I think what he's trying to say here is that when one makes this ethical or religious covenant or whatever, there is a discovery of some sort of internal housekeeping that is done. That one kind of gathers themselves out of the multiplicity and enjoys in being able to make a commitment for the long term, what is sort of known as the ethical passion, like that sense of like what it means to be a good person. So ultimately, the conception of the proper conception of oneself is to know oneself as a good person, capable of making a commitment, and then have the conception of life itself. I suppose in this first condition for the resolution is that it's not a one-time affair. That ultimately, to be a good person is to embrace the becoming nature of life and to continuously make that covenant. So that life itself is a stream, is a river, whatever you want it, constantly changing, and unless we make commitments or whatever, we'll be swept along in it. So we have to constantly reappropriate the covenant. So I think that's what he means. That was my interpretation. It is not necessarily right of what it means to have a proper conception of oneself and life. And the cool thing about this is he says you cannot learn this from anyone else. And I know there's a bit of irony here because I'm teaching you. But what I'm saying, like I'm on Facebook a lot or whatever, and I see all these like learn so and so from so and so for 99 cents a month or $10 a month or this or that or snake oil or this or that. And Kierkegaard's be like, silence. None of that works. The only way that you can learn what this earnestness truly is, because I think I probably have put it into words the best that I possibly can, and like Kierkegaard will talk about it in other areas, what it means to have ethical and religious passion and what this inwardness is, because it has a multiplicity of mood states that are associated with it. The only way for you to truly understand it is if you get to work and get doing it.
Yeah, and Kierkegaard even says, step aside veneration for the venerable. First come to know the difficulties. And then experience points to him and says, see here, love has conquered everything. In the sense that we need to experience this struggle. We need to realize that there's struggle and then experience it. Whether it means realizing the depths and the low lows of erotic love. Or whether it means, and then getting to that commitment of inner strengthening. Or whether we just have to go within ourselves and understand. And maybe we see skeletons in our closet we didn't want to, but doing that, then we can understand what it means for love to conquer everything, because conquering isn't always that easy. Even if you win a battle, there is still casualties. So
it's hard to secure the ground. I mean, look at, like, if you think about it really in terms of a battlefield, like, look how many times, like, say, territory in Iraq has changed hands between the United States and sure. Like militant insurgencies. Like how many times have we had to retake and take Mosul or something like that? You know, like just great, awesome. You conquered that day, but to hold on to it, like that's a whole different matter.
Yeah, and what's another layer to that too is that we don't want it to be a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that we don't want to win, and then realize that we lost more than we gained in that. So I wonder if that comes with the second requirement where sure you can realize that you have this inner struggle and you have to do it, but then if you do that you're like, yeah, I got it. Oh wait, something's missing. You know, like a phantom limb pain. You say, wait, why don't I? Wait, I'm committed to this person. I love them so much, but something's missing. And I wonder if that's where Kierkegaard's gonna put God, or we're going to get that tripartite relationship of marriage.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. I think that's what he's. I think what he's going to say, and this is going to be very upsetting to people. I think what he's going to say is that you can't really have one precondition for the resolution without the other. Because I think there are probably a lot of people who are like, hey, I don't believe in God, but I definitely am into this ethical commitment. Right. Like my marriage is going to be like is going is going to have that ethical safeguard, and I think Kierkegaard thinks that maybe it'll get you to a certain point.
Yeah, but there's always going to be some kind of despair.
Yeah, and he's like, and I think what he's going to say is like that ethical upkeep may be too exhausting to do without having God in the mix. You may get further than the individuals who are just glued to one another because of like physical attraction. Like ethical purity plus physical attraction is better than no safeguard whatsoever. But I think he thinks that ethical guard will dip like at some point, or that it maybe won't, like it won't foment the passion of that original erotic love.
Do you have any not practical example, but maybe some concrete example of, two people, they were together and they, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of it practically, or just because it seems very abstract in the mind, where it's just like, maybe the ethical marriage is fine and it's good, but maybe it's the idea that we don't know what's actually going on.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. I've never been married or divorced, so I can't really say. But I think he has in mind a lot of people that would shun divorce, but like they'd be like, giving up on your marriage, like that's so selfish, or like he's with the secretary or she's with the pool boy or whatever else. That's so selfish. Meanwhile, their marriage itself has kind of become hollowed out, and those individuals need to look in the mirror and say, well, look, what can I do to work on my marriage too? So there's like a lot of blame to go around. There's like, just because an individual has gotten formally divorced or had an affair or something like that doesn't mean that the individuals who are making that judgment have perfect marriages themselves. Mm-hmm. I could maybe think of some examples, but I also think it's the case, and I think would speak to what Kierkegaard's saying, that the only people that really know like the true dynamic of a marriage are the people that are involved in it. Like, yeah. I don't think I could really like assess like anyone that I would pick. I would just, I'd be trespassing.
No, we're just talking about just examples, just very vague examples. But I do like the idea of, marriages work, so you have to go through any kind of pain in order, even if somebody realizes the work and they do the work, sometimes that just leads to miserable people or just resentment.
If you're doing the work, it's kind of like you're going through the motions. Like, where is that renewing fount of joy? Like, I guess my concern would be is if you haven't made the further sort of resolution that involves, or the further condition for the resolution, meaning the true conception of God, and we need to get into that a little bit here, and kind of like, if we want to keep this about an hour. I think he thinks, I could see him thinking that it all becomes very laborious work. That unless you get God in the mix there, that sort of helps you, that humiliates you in a positive way, humbles you, I think it can get really exhausting. And if God's not there to prop both of you up, that moral work may just wear you down without it. He doesn't. I don't think he gets into that here. But knowing what I know of Kierkegaard, for instance, like he thinks that there's a despair in other works he'll talk about, especially like the sickness unto death. He thinks even if you are a ethically righteous person, that there's a despair endemic in ethical projects because you can't attain moral perfection. You're like, I can't make us have a perfectly racially just system. Like, I can't perfectly like cure cancer. I can't
have the perfect marriage.
Or I can't have the perfect marriage. Or I can't perfectly make education accessible to everybody. Like I'm gonna fall short in some way, and but it's so that he calls that the despair of defiance. If we don't reach out for some further assistance from God, it's an obsession with our own sort of autonomy, and we need God to overcome that exhaustion. It's
wonderful you mentioned that, because that's another wrinkle I don't think we've explored much. I think in the other podcasts we have talked about the despair of the aesthetic, and maybe you all did touch upon the despair of the ethical and fear and trembling, but it's great that we finally have that layer of what are the limitations of the ethical life, and we're just reaching and we can't really get there. So like a perfect marriage, even if you put in the work, there's still this lack.
Yeah, I think for us, if you want to, and I think it would be a multi-podcast development. It would be going through the sickness unto death, and that is one of my favorite works of Kierkegaard. It's very difficult and very dark. But we can talk about that some other time. In my opinion, it's one of the most impactful. Like when I tell people, my perception has changed because we're doing all these more obscure polyonymous texts. But before we embarked on just studying all this Kierkegaard, I would have said like with like my right hand, I would have offered The Sickness Unto Death because it emphasizes the depravity of mankind, and then with my left hand, I would have said Works of Love. If no one had ever read Kierkegaard, because then you understand sort of like what it's like to come on the other side and to experience God's joy.
Nice. Well, let's get into God's joy then. Let's get into the second requirement we've found the lack of just doing the work, and even of a romantic love, and now we have to get into what's the second requirement.
Yeah. So the second requirement is to make this true conception of God, and he's going to say before he gets into it, he lists like what it's not. It's not going to be a poetic, creative fantasy. Mm-hmm. It's not an indifferent thought, and he says it's not an addendum to the conception of life in oneself. I believe that's a jab at sort of Kant's moral theology, where individuals sort of graph on some positing of the divine because they get exhausted with all this moral work that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And on page 63, he says, "On the contrary, it comes and penetrates and crowns everything and was present before it became clear." So yeah, it's sort of this like inevitable conclusion that we're like, and when we finally reach it, we're like, damn it, like this was all around us to begin with. Like, why did it take me X amount of years of struggling and floundering or whatever? Like, it's this omnipresent thing. Mm-hmm. It's like oxygen, but like I was too dumb. It's like you're living in the Middle Ages and you don't even know what oxygen is, you know? Sure. And then you find out and you're like, I actually believed in something like ether or phlogisteron or whatever they used to believe in the Middle Ages, and then you come to the true knowledge of it and you're like, oh, now I know what O2 is. I think it's almost like that way with God. It's like it was right. It was always there all along. And there was so what I think was particularly cool. What I think the thing that I liked most about this section that we haven't talked about, and it's like probably the last big idea that I will mention because it seems like we've covered everything else. Whatever this true conception of God is, he says something to the effect of God does not speak in a human language. It doesn't say, there's no like booming voice or burning bush or whatever it is. Like, hey, CJ, love your wife. It's not like that. He says that the language of God is the action of resolution. So when one makes this sort of ethical, religious, existential covenant, one is in a way, by the constant sort of earnestness and thankfulness and gratitude that's involved in, and in the humiliation of making this covenant, confessing yourself before God or whatever, that is a conversation. It doesn't happen in human words, like in language, but it happens in some. He'll talk about it in other places in the authorship as an existential communication or a subjective understanding that maybe through this ethical religious work one becomes, I don't want to say of one mind, because then that would be to elevate the individual into God or something like that, and Kierkegaard I don't think wants to do that, but the ethical religious work makes one understood to God, and God is understood to the individual. It opens up a conduit of communication between individual and divine. So that's like the last big idea I wanted to.
No, so it's like even though when we do the work, there's then the recognition that God is a part of that work. That even though we put in the work to have a good marriage, we have to realize that God is a part of that, or is the one that is giving us the strength and the resolution to do that, and that we have to be thankful and show gratitude towards that every day, every second, if we can.
Yeah.
I suppose, yeah. That's huge. That's
kind of huge, man. So, I mean, I have some other quotes here, like, the vigilance that will make the final Thanksgiving the most beautiful. I suppose this is like when we're like ultimately like resurrected and with God or whatever one day. Make the final response to God speaking, the beginning of which was that happiness, the well-pleasing and true thanksgiving of gratitude. Like essentially that like like one can go about like making the earnest thanksgiving and commitment now that ultimately this is going to be like you can give thanks now because in that sort of resolution one is already experiencing the unification with God because you're communicating with God.
Yeah, and Kierkegaard even goes further in talking about how resolution needs to be constant. You can't just, when you have a bad time in your marriage, say, oh, God, please help me. Please help me do this or that. I can think of It's a Wonderful Life, where it's only at the end, it seems like, or like close to the end, that George Bailey prays. You never see him pray to God in any other moment, but it's only when he's going through the worst moments of his life, and his wife, and he yells at his wife and kids, and he's just a mess. And it's only then.
Oh yeah, they're like playing on the piano.
Yeah,
or something.
and it's just like, why would you torment the children? It's only then that he says, I'm not a praying man, but please God help me, give me some sort of sign, and it's only then. But Kierkegaard would say that's a mockery of God if you're only come during the good times. I mean, he uses the example of the government loan office, and I guess whether the poor have a positive, reception or conception of it, or like, what do you think of the loan office? You're like, I go to it when I need a loan, I guess. It's not this joyful conception of it that Kierkegaard wants us to have, and I think the joy that a marriage dips into, or anything that we do dips into, has to have that constant reception and conception of God. And I think that's what Kierkegaard is getting at too, and I wanted to add.
Yeah.
We need to give thanks all the time. We need to constantly be in gratitude, just for even the struggles. I mean, we talked about that even in one of the upbuilding discourses that we went over, that everything is a gift from God, so that any struggle, any work we put in is, like you said, a way of God telling us to just keep working, or I don't know, or just to believe. I'm not really sure if I'm making any sense.
No, you are, man. I'll have to say this. Connect this up. I've been reading our good friend Robert Schutt's book, and he talks about how what it actually means for the kingdom of God to be at hand, and I think that's like that, or that essentially like one can have the relation like that it's in our midst in so much we're performing the existential activity. I don't know if that's what he meant in his book, but I think that's what Kierkegaard. I think that would resonate with Kierkegaard in some way. Yeah. And we've talked about this in repetition. Was it you and I that did repetition? Yeah. So like the repetition we talked about there, how in the religious repetition, like the only thing that really matters is that moment, and we feel a certain present comfort by living in that moment, where it takes away the anxieties for the future and the guilt from the past, and we're dwelling with intentionality right that moment, because we're like connected up to God.
No, I love that, and that connecting Kierkegaard even mentions too, where he says resolution, and I quote, is not a wretched invention against the wretchedness of God, but is the garment of salvation, and the resolved one is adorned with it to bear worthily the days of prosperity, and the resolved one is powerfully armed in it to conquer on the evil day, and yet the attire is the same. Some way we have to connect. We have to wear the attire all the time. We can't take it off when, it's just, this is really, really good right now. I'm feeling great. I'm just going to, put this on the coat hanger. And we can't just bring it back when we realize that our wife doesn't love us as much, or that we're having trouble with the kids or whatever. We have to always wear that attire. We always have to, like you said, connect to God.
Yeah.
And that's the other point, or if we can do the work, but then that work has to be connected to God in some way.
Yeah, man, I think we nailed it. This felt good. This one, I think we did a pretty good job. I didn't know, I didn't know if I understood it, but I think we got a good handle on it, and there were a lot of insights that emerged in the process of talking about it.
Yeah, I didn't catch on the resolutions, so that's great.
That's cool.
Or not the resolutions, but the two little precepts that you have, that we have to do the work, and that we have to have God within that work. I didn't catch on that when I read through it, so it's great that you brought it out in this.
Obviously there's a lot of my interpretation in there, but I think it connects the dots. We'll let the people decide. CJ, do you want to say anything else before we sign off? Because I've kind of covered everything in my notes.
No, I think I'm great. This is,
All right. Guys, thanks for listening. Download the Noetic app. A lot of developments to come. Take care. Bye.